Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us this month for Side by Side Digital. I'm your host, Rebecca Shively. We've got a great program lined up today. This month, we're tackling all things related to paperwork. I'm sure a lot of you produce corn and beans, but you might also be producing a lot of paper in your operations. Between tax returns, legal documents, receipts, sometimes it feels like we're drowning in paperwork. But how do you know what to keep versus what to throw away? So we've got a special guest on today to help us navigate some of these challenges. Jessica Groskopf is the Regional Extension Economist at the University of Nebraska, located out of Scottsbluff. Jessica is going to share some tips and advice to help all of us keep from drowning in paperwork. Jessica, thanks for being here today. I'll go ahead and turn it over to you.
Thanks for having me, Rebecca, and thank you everybody for being here. Just as a reminder, if you have questions, if you want to go ahead and put those in the Q&A, I would love to hear what questions you have regarding paperwork. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to get started here. So like Rebecca said, I love how she stated it. We produce a lot of things, and one of those things might be paperwork. And when I work with farmers and ranchers as an economist, I work a lot on the business side of their operations, and I hear a lot about, boy, we just have a lot of stuff. And one of the things that we have a lot of is paperwork. And just to show you the kind of paperwork you might have, this is an actual picture of the floorboard of my husband's pickup like 4 weeks ago. And so I know intimately about the types of paperwork that we're constantly inundated with. And so like Rebecca said, my 9 to 5 is as an extension economist for Nebraska Extension. But my 5 to 9 is working with my husband on our farm just north of Scottsbluff. And so I have naturally taken on the role of record keeping in our operation. And this is one of my challenges. And I enjoy it, but I do understand that we've got to design a system that allows us to manage especially receipts and invoices. So today I hope to give you some tips and some tricks to do that. And I want to point out that not everything is going to work for everybody. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And I would like to also say that this was progress for our operation, just to have like 2 or 3 hanging out in the floorboard. Most of the time when we first got married, it was like, they were blowing in the wind because there were, 50 or 60 receipts in our floorboard to start with. So my question is, what are you drowning in? And all record keeping systems, whether that's a production record keeping system or a financial record keeping system, starts with managing your paperwork. And you need a system to file it fast and find it easy. And I wish I had come up with that phrase, but I didn't. And it's important that not all farms and ranches are the same. Depending on what type of operation you have, you might have different needs than somebody else. And not all family members within a farm or a ranch are going to manage paperwork the same way. If you don't believe me on that statement, give your spouse some stuff to file and see how they do it and see how different it is from the way that you would manage that paperwork. So we have to balance all of these things when we're thinking about how are we going to streamline this system. We need to think about what all do we have to keep and why. And then if there are multiple family members or multiple employees that are working through this process, what's the easiest way for us to do it as a unit and as a group so that we can do it effectively and efficiently so that no matter who's in the office, they can find what they need. So I love this quote by Eric Tyler that says, start where you are, not where you wish you were. And a lot of us have inherited filing systems. And when we inherit something, our first instinct is that's not the way I would do it. And I want to throw everything away. And the reality is it might not be worth your time and effort to go back for the last 20 or 30 years and start and clean those out. But you might just have to start with what you have and move forward. So today we're going to go through tips and tricks, and I hope that you think about what you already have in place and what of that is good and what you can modify and adjust as you move forward. So I'm going to pause here for a minute And I want you guys to write down a paperwork related goal for your operation so that you can think about that as we move through today's webinar. So I hope that you took this challenge seriously and you've wrote down a paper related goal for your operation. My first question actually that I ask producers when we start talking about paperwork is, what are you keeping your records for? And resoundingly, the first answer is for taxes. Then, depending on the operation, there might be some regulations that you need to retain those records for. And then, usually, pretty far down the line is actually decision making. And I, as an economist, wish decision making was higher up on that list. But we have to get to a point where we take care of kind of the mandatory things first, so that we can get to the point where we are able to make decisions from our record keeping system. So if taxes is the primary reason that we keep records for, what does US tax law require us to keep in terms of farms and ranches? So I actually like to base my filing system on the IRS Schedule F. If you haven't seen one, I would encourage you can just Google IRS Schedule F and pull one up. And I'm going to show you, there's 2 slides here. This is the top portion of this form that we file with our taxes. And it shows what types of income we are required to report on that Schedule F. So for example, on our operation, we're just a row crop operation. So I'm not really going to report anything related to livestock sales, but we are going to go down probably crop insurance and then grain sales as well. So I can look at this and know I'm going to report these line items. So I need to be able to find documentation related to these line items. You might also hear me in today's presentation call these tax categories. And normally I talk about tax categories in terms of expenses. And this is the bottom portion of the Schedule F. So here you can see this is how the IRS would like us to divide our expenses. So this is how I like to see filing systems work, is that I can be able to find information related to gas, fuel, and oil, or I can find information related to freight and trucking, so that I know that that matches exactly with the Schedule F. Another resource that I have for you is the Farmer's Tax Guide. It's terribly boring to read, but if you have never read one, I would really encourage you to do so. It's probably one of the better IRS publications that are out there that goes through the types of income and expenses that are allowable through the IRS for farms and ranches. And so a lot of people want to get into the nitty gritty with me about, can I deduct this or can we do that? And my answer is always reference the Farmer's Tax Guide and talk to your personal tax accountant, because there's several innuendos about what can be deducted and what can't that are out of the realm of my knowledge. And so I would really encourage you to utilize this resource, as well as a good certified public accountant who can help you with that type of information. And you will be getting a copy of the slides from today's presentation. So you'll get to see all of the links. And then I'm also adding in an additional document that's more of a checklist of all the things that you should have on file. So you'll get all of this information after today's webinar. So what types of documents do you need for each of those tax line items? And the IRS has yet another publication that tells us exactly what types of documents that they look for and what they should specifically identify. And so here's the actual definitions. On the income side, shows the amounts and sources of your gross receipts. Okay, so if you sell grain or you sell cattle, they want to know who you sold it to, the amount or the quantity that you sold, and the price that you sold it for per unit. On the expense side, they want more detail. They want you to identify who you paid, the amount you paid, how you paid for it, the date it was incurred, proof of the payment, and then a description of the item purchased or service received. So my first tip for your record keeping system is that, especially when it comes to expenses, your bank statements and credit card statements are not enough to prove to the IRS the expenditures in particular that you're deducting. So as much as I hate the receipts in the floorboard of the pickup, they are necessary to prove the deductions for tax purposes. They are necessary documentation that I need to retain so that I can validate that with the IRS. So I see some people saying, well, I'm gonna streamline my paperwork system and we're just not gonna collect receipts. It's not necessarily the best way to improve your paperwork trail because you're eliminating some very important documentation from the IRS's perspective. Now, there are other ways that you can collect this documentation, and we'll get into that. But I think it is really important to note that you can't just retain your bank and credit card statements and think that they are enough for a record-keeping system. So my comment as we move forward is I'm going to talk about files a lot as we move ahead. And what I have learned in my years with Nebraska Extension is that a file does not have to be a folder. I think the most common files I see are shoe boxes or boot boxes. But I also see a lot of accordion folders, Ziploc bags, and digital files that are being utilized to retain documentation. I don't care what container they come in, but you do need to have these items grouped and contained somehow, and they don't necessarily have to be in a folder. So I think of my files in 4 sections. And again, files in quotations here. The first will be active files, which are the documents and pieces of my record keeping system that I need to be able to access every day. The second is ones that kind of need to be within arm's reach, which are the current year files. And then I'm going to have on file items and non-farm items. And again, you will be receiving, as a part of today's presentation, a document that's basically a checklist that checklists everything that should be, or almost everything that should be under each one of these sections. So I'm going to take some time and go through each of them individually. So active files, like I said, it's kind of your day-to-day business. And for me, this would include whatever you're utilizing as a register of account. So whether that's a checkbook register or an online or a computer-based accounting software, you need to have that ledger of accounts that's accessible. You're going to have items for deposit, unpaid bills and invoices, unreconciled documents, and documents that don't have enough information to do anything with. So these are the 5 items that I like to see kind of in that active files setup. So just to give you an idea of how I like to manage documents as they come in, I have some sort of an inbox, and this inbox can take many forms and can be located many places. But everything gets collected at one location. I then have my ledger of accounts. I prefer to utilize a financial software. I know a lot of people still use a handwritten check register, which is fine. But I find that financial software for me is more usable. If I'm going to be paying any bills, those are going to go directly in the mail. I'm not going to hold on to them. They're going to go straight out to the mailbox. I'm probably going to put everything for deposit in an envelope that's going to go in my purse for the next time I go to town. And then I'm going to have 3 file folders. Unpaid bills and invoices, maybe. In fact, this happened the other day. I received a bill and it's not due until later in the month. So I'm not going to pay it right now. So it's going to go in unpaid bills and invoices. Unreconciled documents. We'll talk about reconciliation here after a little bit. But unreconciled are going to be bank statements, receipts, invoices that I haven't confirmed and dealt with. And then my needs more information file is the what is this for? Like I received some sort of document, I'm not sure what to do with it, but rather than stewing over it or trying to track somebody down and figure out what's happening, it goes in my needs more information file. So a couple of tips, and I think most of our paperwork woes can be resolved in this active file setup. So the first thing is that you need to set aside time to deal with your documents as they come in. And to me, it's one of those chores like weeding the garden that you need to do a little bit of every week or every day so that it doesn't get out of control. So even if that's, 10 minutes at the end of the day or 30 minutes at the end of the week, going in and opening up all the mail, organizing it the best that you can, and doing what you can to make sure that it's in a usable format as you move forward. Setting aside time is huge. You can't expect to sit down at the end of the year and have a good record keeping system. And you'll beat your head against the wall, right? Trying to get it all done before tax season. Another tip that I have for you is to keep your business and your personal separate. And this includes the documents. Keep your mail separate, and really start that separation, especially credit cards and checking accounts. Keep them separate. And the earlier we can separate that out, the more we know what has to do with our business. This can also be true if you have multiple entities. So making sure that your entities also get separated out if you need to keep separate accounting systems for different entities. One way I like to see farms and ranchers create this separation is by color coding. And having different colored credit cards, checkbook covers, and folders to designate either personal and business or different entities as well. I think it can be really helpful to know, the blue card is for the farm and the ranch, and then there's a blue checkbook folder and there's blue file folders so that it's all kind of streamlined with that. Let's talk about inboxes. Okay, so just like files don't have to be in folders, inboxes can be almost anywhere. And that ugly little brown folder there is probably one of my favorite things. And it's a accordion checkbook folder. You can get it at almost any office supply store. And it doesn't have any dividers in it. It's just like a plain folder that's encased on the sides and has a nice little strap so that it's good and contained. And they fit perfectly in the doors of the pickup. And so they're great for those credit card receipts just to get put into. I've also seen boxes in the machine shed that you just drop your receipts into, have a hole cut in the top. That works really well. Or a box somewhere near the washing machine so that when you're pulling receipts out of pockets before you put them in the wash, those are there as well. So I think putting these inboxes in convenient locations is really helpful and can help you, again, get those receipts contained in a manner that will allow you to go through the rest of the process a little bit easier. My next tip is don't wait to organize. There's nothing worse than trying to deal with a pile of crumpled up, nasty farm receipts. So even if, the few minutes you spend a week is flattening out those receipts and maybe organizing them by date so that they're easier to deal with, that can be really helpful into relieving some of that stress so that they're not just wadded up and ugly. They're at least in a manner of which they're easier to handle. If there are multiple people who are purchasing items for your operation, it's really super helpful to have folks write notes on the receipts or the invoices. So a couple things I like to see is that they circle what credit card number was used. So normally somewhere towards the bottom of the receipt, it'll give you the last 4 digits of the credit card. Or if there were items that were purchased that are not tax deductible, kind of marking those somehow. So for example, if I go to our local farm store and I pick up some oil and I also buy myself a candy bar, I'm not going to itemize that candy bar. So we would, put a check mark or something next to that so that the person who is doing the record keeping knows that that should not be included in the tax deduction amount. So writing notes on receipts and invoices can be very useful. I know of some farms and ranches that have gone away from trying to track down paper. And what they are doing is they are using a separate email account or cloud storage to snap photographs and email those off to the main office. We are not there, but I know that some folks might find that to be a useful way. The thing I would say about this is making sure that account is different from your regular everyday account. That way, again, there's less clutter that happens in that. And the IRS will accept these digital documents as proof. So if you're going to utilize this feature, do know that they are acceptable, but then you've got to do the work to make sure that you can access and retain those digital records. So you're going to see this tip come up a couple of times, and it's know what to throw. A lot of times those invoices or receipts are going to come with a bunch of extras, right? They're going to throw in a brochure, they're going to throw in a return envelope. And I like to get rid of the extras early in the process when we're dealing with active files, so that what I'm left with is the important pieces. So going through and knowing these are the things out of this file that I need to keep, and be able to have that kind of cleaned out from the beginning is very helpful. Get a red folder. A red folder in our house are my problem children. Again, those items that we need more information about. So if you get red foldered at our house, that's usually it actually comes down to receipts that don't have the tax category written on them, or I don't know exactly what it was for. So rather than trying to track whoever purchased it down, at the time it goes in the red folder, and then we'll sit down together and go through that red folder every month or two, just to kind of get those out of the way. Here's a pet peeve of mine. If you are going to keep a check register, please keep it updated. It does you no good, frankly, just to write the payment amount and the check number in your check register if you're not going to keep an accurate running balance and you're not going to reconcile those checks. I've written an entire article on that, and again, you'll receive these slides, so you'll have access to that link. But it's really important that if you're going to keep a check register, and it's going to be your main ledger of accounts, that you maintain it properly. If you are in the digital world and you're using an accounting software, I really like the option of printing checks from your software. So for example, both Quicken and QuickBooks allow you to print checks directly from them, and it eliminates some of the steps. So I can actually enter the transactions and have it print the checks at the same time. So it's a time-saving method, and if you can get it to work properly, is pretty slick. The other thing that I think is important as we're talking about active files is making note of production activities on a calendar. And especially if you're not necessarily the same person who's out in the tractor every day, it can be helpful to know, okay, we started harvest on October 10th, and there's some benefits to knowing this is kind of what was going on that day. So maybe you put something in your red folder that you didn't know what it was, and you could go back and kind of see what was going on that day. And that might give you a clue as to what that receipt or invoice was for. So, just something really simple. Doesn't have to be very complex, first cutting hay or second cutting hay, harvest, planting, just to kind of remind you as you go through the year, especially if it takes you a few months to wrangle your paperwork together. My next comment is to consider the ease of access that you need for your documents. And some things need to be within arm's reach and other things can be put farther away. So I don't think that every file needs to be necessarily in your office, but you do need to consider how easily accessible that item is. I believe this is my final slide of my active files. I might have a couple more, we'll see. But one thing I think we fail to think about is the security of our documents. So there's on the opposite side of ease of access is security. And we really need to be careful about what we're leaving out on the table. These documents often have our social security numbers, our bank account numbers, and our birth dates on them pretty regularly. And so thinking about that, you need to have your documents in a safe and secure location. At minimum, you need a locking file cabinet or some sort of safe where you can lock, especially those highly sensitive documents, away. I also would like to see more farmers and ranchers consider fireproof document storage, for example, for passports, birth certificates, some of those items. And then also, if you're going to be disposing of documents, you need to shred them, especially when we're talking about bank information. Again, they have highly sensitive information. Now, I talked earlier about the fact that you can utilize digital documents for proof to the IRS, but you also need to consider the security and the safety of those items, especially when it comes to backups and cloud storage. So you never want to put a social security number on cloud storage and probably not bank account numbers. So be cognizant of what is going up into your cloud storage, and then also having multiple backups of your farm documents. I can't tell you the number of times I've had to help families kind of reconstruct an entire year of documents because they had a laptop crash. So again, think about the types of information, the ease of access, and how much security those documents are given. And think about, another thing is to think about how easily replaced those documents are. Sometimes it can be very difficult. A passport, for example, is something that's hard to replace. So we need to think about what level of security those documents need. So there's an actual physical process in my mind that transitions a document from an active file to a current year file. And that is the process of reconciliation. And reconciliation is making sure one record of account, usually your bank statement, is consistent with another record of account, which is whatever you're using as your account ledger. So for me, that would be our computer software. For others, that might be the check register. So the process really kind of happens in 3 steps. You're going to compare your monthly bank statement to your receipts. Okay. Banking's really good these days. They sometimes they will still make a mistake. So we need to make sure that the transaction was correct. Then you're gonna, I have it as check register, but again, it could be your financial software. You're gonna compare it to the receipts. And finally, you're going to compare your bank statement to that ledger of accounts. So what we're doing through that process is checking for accuracy with the actual transaction, and then making sure to see if there were any items that haven't posted on the bank account, or we haven't recorded in our ledger of accounts. And again, I have a whole nother article that goes through this process, and an example that you can walk through that will help you with reconciliation. So my items in the active files will stay there until they are reconciled. Here, I would like to see you reconcile monthly. So as soon as that bank statement comes, you need to go back through, and this is where you can, hopefully you've flattened out your receipts. You have the notes on them, you've reconciled them. And if you're using a financial software, you can categorize them for tax purposes, and then they can be filed and move into your current year file. Okay. So we'd like to see that process happen monthly. Depending on the size of your operation, this could take some time. So set aside time monthly to reconcile. Okay. So as we move forward, we're going to talk about current year files. And again, you'll be receiving kind of that checklist document that will have more specifics that goes into what should be under each of these current year files. So I think of these as items 6 through 14. We're going to start out with those reconciled documents. So those receipts and invoices are going to go into some sort of a container. The monthly financial statements, or if you receive quarterly ones, those will be in a file. Any current bank documents, including your balance sheet, cash flow, budget, that should all be kept. Any other current year supporting tax documents. You might receive like a W-2 or a D-pad from your local elevator. That needs to have a location that it goes to. Any current year lease agreements should have a file. I added number 11 recently, particularly because our USDA offices haven't been open. So anything you submit to them, you should retain a copy of. An inventory of supplies. So what do you actually have on hand? And then I also have livestock production records and crop production records. And I could do a whole nother 45 minutes probably on each of those alone. But I do want to point out in particular records for restricted use pesticides and beef quality assurance. There are two really great publications out there. So the National Beef Quality Assurance Organization does have a BQA field guide, and on page 24 of that field guide, they go through the exact documentation that you need to retain for beef quality assurance. And then for those of you who are in Nebraska, the Nebraska Department of Ag also has kind of a record guide, and I would assume other states have a similar guide regarding restricted use pesticides. So you do need to retain, for regulatory purposes, these items. This by no means is the only production records that you should retain, but it's a good start because they do have regulatory authority of how long you should retain, in particular records for these two programs. Okay, so as we move into current year files, we need to start talking about how we're actually going to organize the system itself. And I like to think about filing systems as two levels. The first level being the file, and the second level being the organization within that file. So here are kind of the options that you can use. And I've seen great filing systems use all three of these options. So the first one is chronological. The second one is alphabetical by entity, and the third one is alphabetical or numbered by the number line on the Schedule F. And then when you get within the file, it either needs to be chronological by date or alphabetical by entity. So how do I know which of these is going to work best for my operation and how I should start my filing system? And I want you, when you're thinking about this, to think back when somebody comes in and asks for information, how do they ask for that information? So here's a brief example. Somebody purchased diesel fuel at a convenience store on July 14th. So what's the easiest way for you to find that information? Most likely on our place, somebody's going to say, hey, I bought fuel at ABC convenience store. Can you find that receipt for me? So I actually like to use the middle organization, filed by ABC convenience store and then chronological by date, just because that seems to be the more common way for us to discuss something. But that's because we're using a software that allows us to sort by schedule pretty easily. So once a document's filed, I'm probably not going to pull it out by the Schedule F line item again. So think about how folks ask for things within your operation and what's the easiest way for you to find it. This is also where people will do things differently. And what I will say here is that, and I believe it's my next couple of slides, that consistency on this is key. Once you start a process, at least for a year, you need to try to stick with it at least for that year. If you decide it doesn't work, maybe the following year it's worth changing how you file, but you need to be consistent so that everything that year is filed in the same manner. You might want to add levels of complexity to the physical filing system using different drawers or cabinets or different colored folders, but only do this when necessary. Most farms and ranches probably don't need these additional levels of complexity. So really think about that only when it's necessary. And again, this can be important if you have multiple entities or multiple businesses that you're managing the paperwork for. And here's my consistency is key slide. Again, you need to be consistent with how your documents are filed so that you can go back and find those items easily when there is a question. All right, moving along to on file. And this is the one that we probably have all inherited, are all of the past documents and what's happening. So we'll look at the on file and what we should keep. So past tax documents, and I'll have a slide about how long we need to retain each of these items. Any entity information. So if you, let's say that you are an LLC or you're a corporation, you're going to have those legal documents that you need to have. And you also might have, let's say you have an annual business meeting, you're going to need the minutes for those. So any entity information, to use kind of a funny term, to retain the corporate veil. So again, insurance policies, those kinds of things will be in there. A list of accounts, including your credit cards, lines of credits, and accounts payable. Farm insurance policies, any employee, custom hire, or contractor information. So if you're hiring people, you need to retain some of that. And then a list of assets, including real estate, vehicles, equipment, and machinery, and a list of accounts receivable. Okay. So again, know what to throw. Different documents have different lifespans. So this chart is ever evolving. In my world, somebody will come to me and say, what about this? Or what about that? So here are the items that we know for sure. You need to permanently retain your tax returns. Okay. You don't have to retain necessarily all the documentation that's associated with those older tax returns, but you do need to retain the return itself. I've talked about legal filings or legal documents, including your entity documents, and then proof of asset tax basis. Okay. So most of the time, this is the purchase price, any improvements or depreciation that have been taken on machinery, equipment, land, and buildings in particular. Okay. Your tax accountant will help you with some of that, but it's always good especially if you're going through older files, that you're retaining that proof of your asset tax basis. Some items that it depends on how long that you keep them for are your warranties, loan documents, and lease agreements. And normally I like to see those retained for the life of the document. So if I've got a 5-year warranty on something, I'm going to retain that for 5 years. Same with a loan document. We talked about restricted use pesticides. Whether they're on crops or they're in livestock, we like to see those retained for 3 years. And then also herd health records, including feed records, for at least 2 years. And then from a tax standpoint, any supporting tax documents need to be retained for 3 to 7 years after the date was filed. And then any employment records for 4 years. When we get into long-term document storage, we need to think about preserving the quality of the document Receipts in particular like to fade, and we don't like to see them water damaged or crumpled up. So think about if you're using a container that's not a folder, how well can that document be preserved? I'm going to briefly touch on non-farm documents, and then I see there's some questions in the Q&A. So non-farm records include government issued documents such as marriage licenses, non-farm titles, those kinds of things. Estate planning documents. I don't care how old you are, every single one of you needs to have an estate plan, and you need to have those on file somewhere. Any other official records, such as personal health records or like university transcripts, a list of personal assets and debts, and then a list of key people in your life. Who's your accountant? Who's your lawyer? Who's your banker? Who's your estate representative? Those kinds of things all need to be kept on that non-farm records piece, and it's just as important as your farm record side. So again, know what to throw, carefully consider how you handle personal use documents. When tax laws changed a few years ago, fewer and fewer of us are actually itemizing personal deductions. And so for a lot of farms and ranches, if you're not itemizing those personal deductions, you probably don't need to retain those personal receipts, and they can be disposed of after you have reconciled against your bank statements if you so choose. My final tip of today is don't be the only person who knows the password to your financial records or has the keys to your cabinet. Unfortunately, I've met with a couple of families where mom kept the books, and when she passed, she didn't tell anybody what the password was to their system. So they had to work very hard to recreate that year's taxes, even though she was very good at it because they didn't have the password. So at the beginning of today's presentation, I challenge you to write down one goal. And as I read through the questions here, I'm going to be quiet, and I would like you to write down 2 or 3 things that you learned from today that will help you accomplish this goal. All right, so I see a couple of questions here in the chat. So I'm going to put up my contact information again while we answer some of these questions. So Rebecca, which one would you like me to address first?
Yeah, so the first question here, someone in the audience is asking if you have a good solution to track grain contracts. So when they're coming up, when they're delivered, paid, et cetera, and what to do with partially paid contracts.
Yeah, so I'll show my hand here. I'm in Quicken as my accounting software. And so it's not built for farms and ranches. So I actually keep a separate Excel file that tracks our grain contracts. And so I've just done a simple Excel file that shows the contract number, the quantity, the price, and then the amount and dates paid. And unfortunately, there's really no one size fits all. But if you need help, maybe working with your Excel file, that's my job. So reach out if you need help figuring something out on that Excel file. That's probably the best way to do that at this point. Your local elevator also might have an option to help you kind of track that as well.
Great. Another question. Do you have any recommendations for best time of day to do paperwork? Or maybe you can share how you and your husband approach it for your operation.
Not at midnight before the tax deadline. I think it kind of depends on who you are. I really don't think there's a best time. I think just setting aside time is probably the most important thing.
Great. Any recommendations for the best way to back up QuickBook files?
So it depends on, again, where you're at. I keep a separate USB, an external USB with Quicken is similar to QuickBooks, but making sure you do that on a consistent basis is really important. I know some people have moved to cloud storage because they have increased their security in terms of password protected files. But again, I think it depends on your feelings regarding whether that security is enough or not.
Great. And probably last question we have time for. This is a good one, and maybe another 45-minute webinar topic around this. But do you have any advice for how we can help the seasoned generation kind of get on the same page when it comes to transitioning and, like you said, inheriting some of these record systems?
I think learning from them, there's a reason they've done it the way that they've done it. And so asking questions about what's going on, why did we do it this way? And frankly, it might not be a very good answer, but at least you know the why, and knowing where to pick your battles and where not to. And that can be a challenge. And I hope that you have a good enough relationship with them that you can kind of negotiate and discuss those issues. And hopefully at some point you can come to a compromise on what will work best moving forward.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Really great advice. I love the practical tips. I think I'm going to start a red folder when I get home today. Just love that technique. So I just, again, want to thank Jessica so much for being here today. And thank you, everyone in the audience. Some really great questions and participation coming in. And we'll be back again next month, first Wednesday of the month. That'll be September 1st. And we'll be talking about business negotiations. So you don't want to miss that one. Until then, take care, and we hope to see you online soon.